So I've got a Battletech topic I kind of want to rant a little bit about. And it's something that you as a veteran player may have been asked by newer people coming into the hobby, or maybe you asked yourself at one point. And it's a question that a lot of new people will ask when getting into any game. And it's a simple question, let me know if you've heard it before. Who are the good guys? Well, the short answer is there aren't any. But the longer answer is it's complicated, and while there aren't any good guys, this is not a 40k situation, wherein, all the factions are just unspeakably evil deep down. Except for the orcs. The orcs aren't evil, they're fun. But in Battletech, all of the factions are fundamentally human. They're generally run by three-dimensional people, and while none of them can truly be called good, in fact, arguably all of them are pretty bad to some degree, I also can't outright call them all evil. Let's take, for instance, the faction that a lot of people tend to think of when they are asked, well, who is the good guy in Battletech? I'm going to stick with the Succession Wars just to begin, to make things simpler. Of the great houses, House Davion is often pointed to as the quote-unquote good guys for a while, because on the surface, they stand for truth and justice and democracy, and while yes, they are ruled by a first prince and ostensibly a monarch, the individual planets under their rule do still have free and fair elections for the most part. At least that's what they espouse. And yes, technically, a lot of the planets are allowed to have their own democracies, their own governments, and all of that sort of stuff. House Davion is not a good house, and their nation is not this shining beacon of hope. That's Davion propaganda, in-universe. The reality is that many of the first princes of House Davion, and especially the government of the Federated Suns themselves, are extremely imperialistic and expansionist. During the Reunification War, they arguably committed the worst atrocities imaginable against the Taurian Concordat. That was them who were dropping nukes and orbitally bombarding people and, killing civilians regularly just to get the job done. That was House Davion. And not only that, the Succession Wars only reinforced this. Sure, House Kurita and Liao are not good, and we'll get to them in a minute, trust me. But, to the same degree, their justifications for, we're going to liberate these planets from the terrible oppressors, generally just meant changing hands of who the oppressors were. A lot of people have this picture of House Davion and the Federated Suns as a whole as being this, beacon of technology and democracy, but what they really don't depict in a large scale, and what you learn when you read more and more into the typical living conditions in House Davion, is that that's the core worlds, or the royal worlds, or whatever you want to call it. The closer you are to a seat of power, the more advanced it is, and the more utopian it feels, but the further away you are, which is, by the way, most planets, the more kind of rural and almost backwater it is. To the point where most of your planets are just very low-tech farming or barely modern worlds to the highest degree. In fact, that was one of the reasons why the Federated Commonwealth merger was such a boon to the Federated Suns, was because they did not have the resources that House Steiner did. So, a lot of the time, when Hans Davion, or whichever of the Davions you prefer, talks about their noble and just fight to unite people and free them from their oppressors, just remember, they are wanting resources, they are wanting territory, and they will do almost anything to get it. Case in point, the Fourth Succession War. Yes, it was both Steiner and Davion that worked together, but Davion almost exclusively plotted to and then moved forward with the joint operation of just taking as much of House Liao space as possible. I'm not saying that Liao is just this helpless victim, but to the same degree, they launched an unprovoked attack en masse with a new ally against likely the weakest house, sheerly to grab more territory with the loosest justification of, oh, we must save them from their oppressors. And they did the same thing against House Kurita in the War of 3039. So to anyone who says that House Davion are the good guys in the setting, read a little bit deeper. They're not exactly squeaky clean. And I myself, I like House Steiner, and I love them. They are phenomenal. They're fantastic. Your average citizen lives a very high quality of life. They technically have less voting power than in somewhere like the Free Worlds League or the Federated Suns, but most of the people don't care because they have access to some of the best technology on a wider basis. There's still backwater worlds, but far fewer than in the Federated Suns. They're resource rich on the whole, and their economy is the best, and their industry is the best in the Inner Sphere. That doesn't make them good people, though. Sure, they treat their citizens probably the best out of all of the houses, at least in terms of what they can afford to give them. And yeah, I don't think that House Steiner themselves are necessarily the most evil people, but you'll notice I said the most evil people. They're still pretty bad. Case in point, the FedCom Civil War. I love Steiner. They are my faction of choice. I do not think that what Catherine Steiner Davion did was justified. At all. I'm sorry, but when it comes to the FedCom Civil War, it was just completely unjustified to split the FedCom in half while her brother was off literally defending the Inner Sphere. And I'm not saying that he's innocent either, but still, like, it was an underhanded move and a power grab by someone who just wanted their own little nation back, and it was not okay, and it led to a massive civil war that killed thousands, millions, possibly billions, needlessly. And it just, yeah, no, House Steiner is not this shining beacon of hope either. Not to mention, yes, social generals. I think that it's a little overstated just because of the memes, but yeah, it is a real problem. If you have the money, you can just get into power, and, well, historically speaking, just giving power to whoever has the most money doesn't always end well. But if you want to talk about people who have the greatest power to vote for their representatives, then, well, what about the Free Worlds League? Surely then that makes them the good guys of the setting, right? I mean, they really do have free and fair elections. Their actual government is elected officials, and yes, during times of war, the Captain General does technically take an almost authoritarian position and represent them in times of things like the Star League, but nonetheless, when it comes to domestic policy and individual freedoms, it has the greatest respect for its people, right? Well, kind of. House Merrick, first and foremost, having their dominion over the Free Worlds League for so long, has grown more and more powerful and made that great democracy less and less effective. Don't get me wrong, the democracy's still there, and each of the different dominions and free worlds, as it were, do still get their say in government, but it's almost a galactic Senate-style situation a la Star Wars, which is to say, there's a lot of infighting, there's a lot of argument, and, I mean, they go into civil wars regularly. I believe there's a joke passed around the fan base that the greatest threat to a Merrick is another Merrick, and that's very true. The greatest threats to the Free Worlds League commonly come from within the Free Worlds League, so while yes, they do technically on an individual level have the greatest freedom, they also tend to be the most unstable and the most full of civil strife. It leads to great innovation, it leads to some fascinating, companies that come out of the Free Worlds League, and, sure, you can vote for a lot more than you can in pretty much any other place in the Inner Sphere, but that's not very useful when the constant strife makes it to where you have less money than even some Davion worlds, and you're more likely to get stabbed in the back by a local system trying to grab territory and then justify it later within your own quote-unquote nation. So, no, Merrick are not the good guys either. They're full of infighting, and the Captain General erodes the freedoms of the great democracy that they're supposed to stand for. Well, that leaves just two great houses left, House Kurita and House Liao, the ones that most people point to as being the most evil. If there are villains in the setting, they usually come down to these two. I mean, that makes sense. House Kurita quite literally has the stated goal of wanting to take over the entirety of the inner sphere, if not all of human space. They believe it is the destiny of the dragon to do so. And yeah, they do put their people into a rigid caste system in order to ensure that they stay in line. And yet, as much as all of that is very oppressive, and the government truly is, very, very authoritarian and powerful, it's still a vast space with a rich culture. There's still a lot of personal freedoms that you get on each individual world, and as much as they have enforced a sort of unified culture, there's still a great appreciation for things like the arts and innovation in many areas. They're one of the stricter ones and one of the bigger candidates for something like an evil empire, and don't get me wrong, they fit the bill, but to the same degree, that doesn't mean that everyone in House Kurita is evil. Case in point, Theodore Kurita. He genuinely wanted to undo some of the more oppressive and terrible parts of the Draconis Combine of House Kurita. Not only did he defy his father's death to mercenaries decree, but he also tried to institute a series of reforms and made it to where the military would be punished if they were ever caught doing anything that was unsavory or wrong to conquered worlds. Not to mention that it was Theodore Kurita who pulled the people out of the Rosselhague Republic before it was the Republic. I almost said Rosselhague Dominion, but regardless, it was he who fought against those who, oppressively wanted to still, claim that House Kurita should own the Rosselhagians. And ultimately, there are good people in House Kurita. Now, are they the majority? No, of course not. But that said, they're not wholly evil. The same can be said for House Liao. House Liao is probably the closest thing you're going to get to a police state. I mean, they've got a big secret police force, they basically dictate where and when citizens can go, and worse than that, you're not even born a citizen. Children are considered property of the state, who allow their parents to raise them, almost like leasing them, and then these children eventually have to take a citizenship test to be granted their citizenship. I mean, you wouldn't want to live there as a civilian. And yet, it's still an interstellar empire. And as terrible as it is to have such an oppressive government structure, oppressive governments are the worst when they are small. When you get large scale, you still have to contend with the individual wants and needs of planets. You can squeeze them dry, but if you squeeze too tight, you'll kill them. A lot of the best House Liao leaders recognized this and allowed certain freedoms, in fact a lot of freedoms, personally to the planet lords and whatnot, as long as they obeyed whatever direct edicts from the federal government were there. Now, obviously, it still has problems inherently, but people in House Liao space can still live a good life. Maybe not a rich life, but a good life nonetheless. And again, they are often the victims of other great houses. Case in point, the Fourth Succession War, where Steiner and especially House Davion just straight up invaded them for really no reason, just to take as much territory as possible and try to wipe them out. I mean, a lot of those planets were not being aggressive. A lot of those planets were not prepared for an invasion, and they were just stomped by larger great houses who claimed that it was for the greater good and the liberation of the people. Does that mean that House Liao is justified in being destroyed because of this? A lot of meme answers would probably say yes, but in reality, when you really think about it, no. The great houses, in short, are not supposed to be good guys and bad guys. That would kind of defeat the point of a setting like this. In fact, most factions outside of just the great houses also fit into this strange category. ComStar is one of the shadiest and spookiest groups in existence, and is arguably responsible for most of the ills of the Succession Wars era, and especially later. Especially after the Civil War era. Anyway, and yet, without them, most of humanity wouldn't be able to have interstellar communication, and there were many occasions in which they saved the Inner Sphere, in particular the Battle of Turkaid, and fighting against the clans. Without ComStar's help, the Inner Sphere would have fallen. And so that makes them a little more nuanced and complicated, not to mention that there's a lot of inner strife within their own circle, and again, it boils down to the individuals. And mercenaries. There's just as many terrible mercenary companies that just want the money and would do terrible things to the places they invaded, just as much as there are mercenary companies who are trying to fight for a particular cause or sign on for one group with great loyalty to them. Everything in Battletech is kind of shades of gray, and I prefer it that way. Now, I would be remiss not to mention the clans. And I'm not going to go over all of them. All 20/22/18, depending on who's writing. And then, of course, there's splits within the clans, and then it breaks down even further. I can't even keep track when it comes to the Ill Clan era. I'm not talking about that right now, but what I'm talking about is the clans in general. They're seen as a great invading force and usually positioned as just evil, as just the opposition, and I have to admit, as a spheroid myself, a lot of clan culture is very hypocritical at best. But to the same degree, there's a lot of individuals within the clans that, you can use best intentions for justification for anything, but beyond just having good intentions, are genuinely good and honorable people who recognize the issues within the system and adapt it. A couple of the clans, in fact a lot of them, ended up starting to realize a bigger picture when they came back to the Inner Sphere, and once they intermixed with the Inner Sphere nations, they sort of calmed down, so to speak, or which is to say, they adopted a lot of Inner Sphere doctrine. And there is something to be said for the clan's way of fighting. No civilians, no individuals who are non-combatants allowed in the way, and keeping as much fighting to as few warriors as possible for determining who owns what in order to prevent wanton destruction. Now, the clan invasion tested these, and a lot of the clans found themselves to be a lot more evil than, they could have been. But to the same degree, I don't think that the clans themselves are inherently evil, just as the clans are not inherently good. Nobody in Battletech is good or evil. They are factions. Each of them have good people, each of them have evil people. Each of them have something they bring to the table for whatever kind of person or party or faction you want to play. So, if you're looking to justify fighting against any of the factions, there's a reason. They've all done something absolutely messed up. They're too large to not do something messed up. But if you're looking for a reason to fight for any particular faction, they've all done something worth fighting for. This is a massive setting. At some point or another, there is something worth fighting for. Heck, reading through some of the actual Battletech fiction, as much as I may think that Steiner was completely at fault for the FedCom Civil War, I can't call the Davion side of that Civil War innocent either. She may have started it, and she may have been completely unjustified in doing so, but there's a lot of actions that Davion committed that were pretty messed up to the same degree. Just because I think that one side did something worse than the other doesn't mean that the other side doesn't have anything worth fighting for. And that's one of the reasons why wargames like Battletech are so great, and why the fiction is so great. Because it tries to look at the grand human experience. It tries to look at, warfare as a concept. It takes a broader look at conflict, and it presents a variety of options, more than just good and bad. So, are there any good guys in this setting? No. But there aren't really explicitly evil, bold-face, just bad guys either. There are worse people, and there are better people, but for every Cordera Perez, there is a Victor Steiner Davion. Both of them have done great and terrible things, some more than others. And that's the fun of this setting. So, which faction do you like? Who's the good guy? Whoever you decide to fight for. Or maybe you just want to fight for the highest bidder, like a good mercenary. Honestly, no disrespect there. But hey, this was just a little rant I wanted to make on, who are the good guys in Battletech, because sometimes you get asked that question, and if you wholeheartedly believe that one faction are the good guys, you might have been reading a little too much of their propaganda. Anyway, that's all I've got for this little battle rant. And to anyone who listened all the way through, thank you for listening to my voice.